Years ago, there was this little TV movie based on a book and narrated by Ray Bradbury, of all people. It was called The Halloween Tree, and it really stuck with me even though its premise is fairly simple. On Halloween, in a little town where anyone could live, there are these kids, and they were dressed up respectively as a skeleton, a mummy, a witch, and a monster. And they decided to go to their friend Pip's house because he was their unofficial leader. Unfortunately, they see him loaded into an ambulance, and they read a note from him saying he's got appendicitis. Now, I've known people that have had appendicitis. It's fairly easy to deal with, but if left untreated, it is fatal. But they think it's a prank because they see Pip looking like a ghost running away. And he leads them to a creepy house where they didn't know it existed. And behind the house was the titular Halloween tree, a huge oak-style tree covered in lit jack-o'-lanterns. And they find Pip climbing up to get one of the pumpkins. They also meet Mr. Moundshroud, voiced by the late great Leonard Nimoy, who chastises the kids for not knowing the origins of their costumes. But then he gets distracted when Pip steals a pumpkin that looks suspiciously like him and uses it to disappear somewhere into the past or future. Well, not wanting his property being stolen, he decides to go after Pip, but he needs help, so he recruits the kids and decides to teach them a little lesson about Halloween. So they go to an old barn that they also didn't know was in town and use the remains of several old circus posters to construct an autumn kite, which they then use to fly back in time to ancient Egypt. Those of you who are familiar with Lankara will know he doesn't like ancient Egypt. But I'm not going to do a clip from him, so that's that. Anywho, they find the origins of trick-or-treating in the form of spirits moving about a village and sampling food left on everyone's doorstep for them. They even meet a nice family whose great-grandfather is having dinner with them, even though he's been dead a while. They chase Pip into one of the tombs out in the desert, and Moundshroud explains to them the origins of mummification and why people dressed up their dead for eternity. Turns out it's just another part of living, just in another form. Pip manages to give him the slip, and they then travel to Stonehenge, where a group of druids is celebrating New Year's, because back then, New Year's Eve was October 31st. They then come across some witches making brooms, and Moundshroud explains to the witch girl, just like he did with the mummy boy, the origins of witches. Turns out the word witch is another way of pronouncing the word wits, because anyone who had special knowledge of stuff was considered magical and sometimes outcast. And after briefly turning into a black cat, Pip hops on one of the brooms and gets it to fly. And Moundshroud activates the flight power of the other brooms and takes the kids for a ride, all the while evading people who don't like those who have their wits about them. And we hear about a dark chapter in humanity where those who were too smart for their own good were persecuted. Yeah. Next, we end up in France, where Notre Dame Cathedral is being built, only it's still in piles. So Moundshroud, revealing that he can't be in the shadow of a church for very long because, well, it's never explained. He just can't do it. So he instructs the children to finish the cathedral with their feet by running up and down what will be the corridors and parapets of Notre Dame. They actually built the cathedral. Too bad they can't rebuild the cathedral this way again after that fire, but they're working on it. The only problem was, after they finished the cathedral, they realized there were no gargoyles. So Moundshroud calls forth dark spirits to petrify themselves and become the guardians of Notre Dame. Unfortunately, Pip has become a gargoyle as well, the water spout kind, and only when rainwater comes out of his mouth can he speak. He tells the kids he feels like he's dying, and he says his goodbyes, but they refuse to let him go. So they break him loose, and he manages to give them all the slip again, just before Moundshroud can get the pumpkin. So, once again, he takes the kids on a ride using some of the gargoyles brought to life, and they head to Mexico to celebrate Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead. Now, technically, that holiday is celebrated, I believe, in November, after Halloween, but it's been lumped up with Halloween, so there you go. Basically, Moundshroud tells of how the people of Mexico remember and celebrate those who've gone before them, and basically make death not seem so scary. It's a way of coping. You might not go on in this form, but you might just go on in another form. And anyway, they follow Pip to the cemetery where he's stuck in a tomb full of naturally mummified Mexicans, and Skeleton Boy has to rescue Pip's pumpkin by running a gauntlet of these possibly partially alive mummified Mexicans. And he succeeds, only for Moundshroud to take the pumpkin away and say finally he's got his business concluded, because Pip's life is coming to an end. That's what this whole thing has been about. Pip is dying, period. Only the kids refuse to let that happen, so they make a trade. The last year of their lives for Pip's life. And while he tries to dissuade the kids from giving up that time, especially when it's him that's going to collect that year at the end, they are determined. So he gives them a candy skull with Pip's name on it to eat and seal the deal. So he finally takes them home, where they head back to Pip's house to find that his pumpkin is on the porch and Pip is okay. They took out his appendix, and while he was under, he had some crazy dreams. And he indicates that the adventure was real and possibly in his head, and thanks them for sticking up for him. Meanwhile, Moundshroud blows out his pumpkin's candle and dissolves into mist, and a wind picks up all the pumpkins and carries them to who knows where as the sun rises. So yeah, the Halloween Tree is a pretty decent, simple story of the sort of origins of Halloween, although it's a little more complicated than that. It's kind of creepy in places, but very entertaining, especially with Ray Bradbury actually reading parts of the actual book as part of the narration. If you can find it online, great, but It's better to find on hard disk, like a DVD or a Blu-ray, because you never know when something that should not be lost media becomes lost. Anyway, this is Mr. J signing out and reminding you, always treat Halloween as if it's the last one you'll ever have, because it just might be. And while death doesn't have to be scary, that doesn't mean you should give up on life. Try to live as much as possible before the end, because it's not the length, it's the quality. So, happy Halloween, folks. And watch out for Mound Shroud.